attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, this is Jim, and I am pleased to be able to fill in tonight for Wendy Patton. This is Jim Aydelotte, and I hope that you guys are going to get some great information tonight. I know you will. We're going to just wait a minute or two, and we're going to get started here in just a moment, so I will be right back. Okay, I trust everybody can hear me and everybody can see the screen. And welcome to the Inner Circle call tonight. This is Jim Aydelotte once again, and I'm filling in for Wendy Patton. And we've got some great questions we're going to be covering this evening. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And so the first question tonight is, let's see if I can change the screen here. What is a fair down payment on a lease option? You mentioned zero on up to $10,000. Well, a fair down payment on a lease option is really not using any of your own money at all, if possible. If you have a lease option, and I'm assuming this is a sandwich lease option, so you're going to stay involved, and you're looking at putting a down payment on a property that you're going to be taking control of, then you're going to probably want to put nothing down if at all possible. In some cases, and in some cases I'm willing to do this, if the owner wants something down, I will offer them a portion or a percentage of what I get from a tenant buyer. So in other words, if the owner says, well, I have to have a couple $1,000s down, and if I know that I can get $6,000, $8,000, or $10,000 down on this particular property because of the price, I will offer a percentage of what I get down to the owner, but I won't give it to them until I get it. There have been a few cases where I will actually give $1,000 down just to go ahead and immediately, have that out of the way, and that's really kind of up to you. If you can do that, then of course it's well worth doing. And at the same time, if they can wait until you get money from a down payment to you, of course that's always best. So in the end, it really is kind of subjective. A fair down payment is really, from my perspective, a payment that I don't have to make. So even if I have to take a portion of my option fee from my tenant buyer and give it to the owner, I'm okay with that because that's still not coming out of my pocket. So that's a little bit of a subjective thing. How do you tell a seller market is flat, current bubble is bursting when mainstream media is saying the market is up, home prices are up, consumer confidence is up, etc.? It's difficult when a seller doesn't agree the market is flat or heading down. Okay, that's a great question. I haven't had to face this. Typically, people get a sense for what their market is just because they're kind of in tune with what's happening in the neighborhood or in their area. But it's always best, if you need to show a seller what the median sales price is doing for your zip code or their zip code. If you've got a flat market and you can pull up the median sales price. The easiest place to get it from my perspective is Trulia. Just go to trulia.com, and what you can do is you can go right in there and you can just type in the zip code, go to market information, and it'll give you the 1, 5, or 10-year time frame for what the median sales price is doing. It'll give you what the median and average listing price is, and whether it's week over week or year over year. So you can have that information if you need to. If it's a matter of a seller just doesn't want to believe, a lot of times sellers think their house is worth a whole lot more than what it really is. And that's typical. So that's why it's also important to show them what their house is worth, show them what comps are. So you might want to keep that in mind as well. What happens if the owner does not make mortgage payments on a lease option? Has this ever happened to you? No. This has not happened to me in the several years that I've been in cranking out lease options. But what does happen? That's really, because it doesn't mean it won't happen. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. What you want to do is you want to have bank authorization. And in Wendy and my course and in the contracts, there is a bank authorization letter that is notarized with the owner signing it, that gives you the right to contact the bank to find out if things are current, to get all the information you need. And if you find out that the mortgage is behind, you can always go ahead and begin making payments directly to the bank if you're not already. You can prevent a lot of this from happening if, when you do an option, especially a sandwich lease option, you make the mortgage payment directly. That's the best way to do it. And in making that mortgage payment directly, that's getting paid. But at the same time, I can honestly say this hasn't happened to me, even in cases where, for example, I am paying the seller for their mortgage. So you always want to probably have that bank authorization form notarized and signed by the seller that gives you the right to contact the bank and, if necessary, make the payments directly. Okay? The market where I live is a very hot seller's market. Would I be better off working in another state? Well, I don't know. Hot markets are still okay for lease options. You don't have necessarily probably the luxury of finding motivated sellers to a point where they would be in a flat or a declining market. In hotter markets, what you want to do is you want to still advertise, but you always have to remember, even in hot markets, there are people who are in trouble either with their mortgage or with their situation. 2 houses, moving, transfer for a job, divorce, what have you. So they, in some of those cases, they may not have the ability to wait to move a property, or here's another scenario, even though it might be a hot market, they might be slightly underwater, or they may not be able to put it on the market and pay a realtor fee. So there are situations like that. I would certainly continue to advertise, and I would absolutely find absentee owners. I would target excuse me. I would target not just absentee owners. I would target rentals, and I would still pursue those actively. Would you be better off working in another state? Well, I don't know. It really depends on your situation. Keith and Shannon French, they do this 1,200 miles away from the comfort of their home. Joe McCall does it virtually everywhere. So you really don't have to necessarily be bound to just your market. And I think if you're going to do that, you're definitely going to want to focus on the cooperative or the link options. Now, you really don't want to do sandwich lease options in a market that you can't get to easily, readily, because with a sandwich lease option, it is a little bit more hands-on. You've got to stay involved. You may have to take care of things potentially on the property. So I don't recommend you do a sandwich lease option long distance. That's not something that I would recommend. So it really kind of depends on if you're capable of working in another state, and maybe you are able to put systems in place and whatnot. And in putting those systems in place, you can handle, business in another state. So if you're capable of doing that, you might want to do that. You might want to partner. Here's the other thing. You might want to partner with another real estate investor in another state, and maybe, I don't know, just thinking off the top of my head, maybe what you want to do is you want to get the leads and find the deals and help the other investor work through some of those. You could split options with investors that way. I know people that do that now, and that's certainly an option as well. I just think that you don't need to really go out of state. A hot market doesn't necessarily mean there won't be any business there. It just means your marketing is probably going to be a little bit different. Your message may be a little bit different. So don't be bound by just thinking that you have to do something in a declining market. Okay? Colorado requires a real estate license to assemble a sandwich lease option. Should I get licensed, or would I be better off working in another state? Dean. Well, that's a little bit subjective as well. Dean, if you feel as if you want to get a license and do sandwich lease options, by all means, there's nothing that would prevent you from doing that. At the same time, could you work in another state? You could. You could do link options remotely, like we talked about before. So, again, this one might be a little bit more subjective, but when it comes to sandwich lease options, again, really don't recommend you do sandwich lease options outside of an area that you can get to. I would only do linked or co-op options from a distance. So hopefully that makes sense. How do you answer sellers' concerns about losing tax advantages if greater than a 3-year lease term is used? I'm assuming this goes along with the owning it for 2 years, living in it for 2 years, and not letting it go 3 years without living in it, where you may be subjected to different capital gains tax. I'm assuming that's what that is. Well, I've really never had to worry about a seller's concern about losing tax advantages if it's a longer than a 3-year lease term. In this case, I'm guessing that if it's a link or a sandwich lease option, you have to remember that your goal is to find a near qualified tenant buyer. And in finding a near qualified tenant buyer, what you really, really, really want to try to do is find a tenant buyer that's going to be lined up and ready to be financed in that, no more than 18-month or so time frame. So that really shouldn't be an issue. When you're first starting off, a lot of people will take the very first, they'll take the first tenant buyer that they can get, because it's the first $5,000 or $10,000 that comes along, and maybe they're pretty shaky when it comes to being financeable. So that's why you always want to run them through one of your local mortgage brokers, and I have several that are willing to do that for free in my area. I'm sure you can find them in your area, to find out how long it would take for them to get financed. And so maybe that wouldn't be as big of an issue in terms of tax advantages. I've never had this even a question come up, in the 6+ years or so that I've been doing sandwich lease options or lease options. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, try to get near qualified tenant buyers. That's the key. Okay. Is it feasible to do lease options from a different state? Yes. I think I've answered this in a couple of different ways. It is feasible to do lease options from a different state. However, don't do sandwich lease options. You really want to stay with the co-op or link options at that point, only because you're going to be putting the tenant buyer and the seller together, and you get paid up front, and then you're out. What if your area has a very hot market and sellers don't have a problem selling? What do you suggest instead of lease options? Okay, maybe this is similar to the other question, but let's take it with a little bit different of a slant. If your area has a very hot market, sellers don't have a problem selling, I would probably be looking at absentee owners to target. Like I mentioned before, absentee owners, the for rent section, I would look at that. At the same time, this actually may be a market where you might want to do fix and flip. Now, we haven't talked about fix and flips at the boot camps or anything like that because that's not what those boot camps are for. But you probably would benefit from having a rehab, at least a couple throughout the year going, to where you could fix them, flip them, use private money, and get in and out very quickly. You could even possibly use hard money lenders where, you know, they want to be cashed out within 6 months or a year or 18 months in some cases. I've seen some go, you know, hesitatingly as long as 24 months. Hard money is different from private money. Hard money lenders are all over the place. They advertise. You're going to pay a pretty fair point spread for hard money versus a private lender. But let me just say this, that if you've got a hot market and things are selling very quickly, and you have the wherewithal and you have the ability to identify repair costs, understand what rehab costs are going to be, if you follow a simple formula, you will pretty much, you will be safe. Now, the formula that I use, because I do some rehabs, in fact, right now we've got 4 rehabs, and they're in that, I think total we've got about $700,000 or $750,000 in rehabs going right now. But here's the formula. It doesn't matter the market. The formula doesn't change. It can if you decide to. But the formula that I use is take the after repaired value, or the ARV. You multiply that by 0.7. ARV times 0.7 minus repairs. So ARV times 0.7 minus repairs equals what is known as the MAO, which is maximum allowable offer. So let me repeat that and I'll explain it. ARV times 0.7 minus repairs is MAO, maximum allowable offer. Say I've got a $100,000 property, the ARV is $100,000, and it needs $20,000 in work. So I've got a $100,000 property, it needs $20,000 in work. If we plug that into that formula, what do we have? 100,000 times 0.7 is $70,000. 70 minus 20,000 in repairs is 50,000. 50,000 would be the absolute maximum that I would pay for that property. That's the maximum allowable offer. You've got to figure a couple of things. Not only do you have the costs of rehab on top of that, you've got holding costs. Maybe there are a month or two of holding costs. You've got possibly realtor fees if you're going to flip it. So and then you've got interest back on your money, private or hard money lender, that you need to pay. So when it's all said and done, if you paid 50 for a property and you put 20 into it, you say, oh, well, I'm going to make 30 grand. Well, hypothetically, you'd make 30,000 bucks, but in practice, you might not, because you're going to have insurance, utilities. You may have 6% or several $1,000s in realtor fees. You might be looking at, instead of a $30,000 profit, you might be looking at a $20,000 or $22,000 profit. And then if you subtract, you know, for 70 grand, let's say you've got a 10-point spread, that's 7 grand. Well, now I'm down to about a $15,000 profit. So that formula is meant to keep people safe. So if you've got a really hot market, well, maybe you want to do a rehab here and there. But if you're talking about options, you would just want to advertise differently, and you want to look in different places for people to do lease options. So hopefully that helps. And if you're a little bit wary about rehabs, that's a whole different seminar, and that's something that you want to be sure that you know exactly what you're doing. Okay. What if a seller wants to rent it? Let me see, it's cut off there just a second. What if a seller wants to rent it to you, but they need to sell this property to get a mortgage for a new house? Okay, so you've got a seller. They want to lease it or rent it to you, but they want to sell the property because they need to get a mortgage for a new house. Okay. We've had this happen, and I can tell you when it has happened, one of the things that we have done is we actually put the seller in contact with one of our mortgage brokers to explain their situation. And most of the time, I haven't had this fail yet, but most of the time, virtually every time, and in fact, in the cases that I'm thinking now, the mortgage broker was able to get our seller financed on a new home, even though they weren't cashed out of house number 1. They want to buy house number 2, house number 1, they have a mortgage, so the mortgage broker says, hey, as soon as you get somebody in the property and you've got it cash flowing, we'll go ahead and, we'll be able to finance you. That has happened, and that's been a pretty straightforward process, but pretty straightforward thing. So we have mortgage brokers. Mortgage brokers can be like real estate investors or realtors. If your mortgage broker or the mortgage company is just one of these big mortgage houses, they don't think outside the box. You want to send your seller to the local credit union or your mortgage broker in town that is creative, and most of the time they can help them. So I always send our sellers to our mortgage brokers, and every time they've been able to help them. Hopefully that helps. Let's see. I have posted multiple ads on Craigslist, Backpage, GG, and others looking for motivated sellers, and I've gotten no response. What is the solution? Okay, you're posting ads to try to get motivated sellers to call you. Well, I really find that motivated sellers call me when I'm using yellow letters and some bandit signs. Outside of that, if you're getting started and you don't have a yellow letter campaign or a mailing list or anything like that, the best thing to do is for you to call the seller. Call FSBOs, call properties for rent, and begin talking with them. And so you may have to do a little bit of mining or digging in order to find a motivated seller. So don't give up on necessarily the advertisements on Craigslist and some other places, but I would certainly expand my horizons, and I would begin calling sellers. And by calling sellers, you will probably find a deal a little bit quicker than waiting for somebody to find you on Craigslist. The other way to get motivated sellers calling you is, if you don't do yellow letters, use social media. For example, in Facebook, you can post in your local Facebook garage sale sites. I don't know if you know that or not, but excuse me, there are what's called garage sale sites or garage sale venues within Facebook that you can post things for sale, or hey, looking for a house, lease to own, rent to own. If you have something, please give me a call. And you can use that as a vehicle to possibly find motivated sellers as well. But again, when I started, I had no marketing whatsoever, none. I didn't even know what to market. I didn't know how to market to owners. I simply just began making phone calls. And I made phone call after phone call after phone call, and I began getting some yeses. And so that would be the thing. That's, to me, the absolute best solution, because you definitely want to be practice up practice up your discussing things with sellers, and the fastest way to plunge into that headlong is to do that by calling them. So do that, don't hesitate, and keep the pipeline full that way. How do you keep the buyer? Oh, let me just say one more point on this previous question. I've gotten 5 leads. We got 5 leads on Friday from Amber. Already called. I happen to get 1 that's interested. The other 4 I'm waiting to hear back on. We're playing phone tag. She called all 5 of them. She found them on Facebook. She found them on for sale by owner, in the for rent ads, for FSBO signs, and so we actively call people as well. So we don't just do yellow letters or wait for people to call us. We actively pursue them as well. Okay. How do you keep the buyer and seller from cutting you out? A proper way of keeping them separated. A buyer and seller from cutting you out. Okay. I'm presuming that means that you need to isolate the buyer and seller from each other while in a sandwich lease. I'm guessing that's what it is. Well, I really haven't had this problem because my contract is with the seller, so I'm actually under contract with the owner. Then at that time, I turn around and I'm able to market the property because I own it on contract. And so when I'm talking to the seller, I'm only talking to the seller. Excuse me. I'm only talking to the buyer. Excuse me. In terms of lease optioning it from me, because I am acting as the principal interest. So as the principal interest, when I'm talking to a tenant buyer, I put my for sale by owner signs up with my phone number, and all our advertisement is based on them coming to me. So in effect, there is the tenant buyers who are calling, they don't have any clue who the seller is. If the seller is wanting to be involved in the process, I can tell you right now that doesn't work real well, especially on a sandwich lease. On a sandwich lease, it's just, I let the seller know, and by the way, there's a little clause in my contract that says that we will enjoy the property free of molestation or this, that, and the other from the seller. So I let them know, well, that's my side of the business, and in order for me to make a profit, that's where I do all the work I need to do with the tenant buyers. And by the way, if I'm going to be in a sandwich lease, some of you know this, maybe some of you don't, but when I tell the seller that I'm going to be guaranteeing the maintenance and payments till I cash them out, and in the process of doing that, they can get on with their life. They don't need to worry about what's happening with their property. So I don't really have any kind of issue with them cutting me out. Now maybe at closing, we can talk about that here, because I think in looking at some of the questions beforehand, there was a question that somebody had with respect to simultaneous closing and how do you do that. So if anybody has a question, by the way, feel free to type it in while we're going through this. If I'm not saying something clear, you can do that on the question side there, and I'll try to make sure I'm attentive to that as well. So let's see what the next question is. What if the seller needs some cash out to do the deal? Clear a short-term balloon payment, almost upside down, break-even status. Okay. What if the seller needs some cash to get some cash out to do the deal? Well, it really depends on how much cash we're talking about. If we're talking about a few $1,000s, I have no problem letting them know that they can have a percentage like we talked about earlier. I'm willing to give them a percentage of what I get from a tenant buyer. And a lot of times I get asked, well, how much do you normally get from a tenant buyer? And I'll let them know. I get a minimum of 5% down on all my properties, or a minimum of $3,500. So if there's a property where, it's in the $60,000 price range, 5% is $3,000, I'll still shoot for $3,500. Now, cleared short-term balloon payment depends on how much it is. If you're talking, more than a couple of percent or so, it's going to be difficult to come up with that cash if you don't have it. So the whole concept behind buying on options is to do it with little or no money and not using any credit of your own. If a seller needs some cash to do a deal, again, are they willing to take some when you get paid by a tenant buyer? And out of that, how much are you willing to give them? If it says, as this question is, almost upside down, break-even status, well, here's a question that I would have for the seller. If, for example, there's maybe a little bit upside down or at break-even, why would they accept any? Why would they need any cash out? My feeling is if they're that close to what the house is worth, they wouldn't get any cash anyway if they sold the house. In fact, if they listed that house with a realtor, what would happen? They'd be bringing money to the closing table. So in this case, being almost upside down or break even doesn't necessarily foster any necessity on my part to want to give them anything. I would explain to them very simply this, that you have no equity in the home. In fact, not only do you have no equity, you might be a little bit upside down. And you're going to go ahead and bring a tenant buyer, let's say in a link or a co-op option, that's going to be making payments to them. That's going to cover their mortgage payment. You get paid out of the tenant buyer's pocket as part of the option fee. If there's anything left over from that, the seller will get that. But in the meantime, bringing the tenant buyer on a linked option allows the seller to pay the mortgage down, to pay the principal down on the mortgage. And so that, if it's a link option, and by the way, it would only be a link option if it's an option, because there's no equity. And if there's no equity, there's no reason to stay in the deal. And if there's no reason to stay in the deal, it's not a sandwich lease, okay? If they're almost at break even, I can tell you too, I wouldn't even do a subject to deal on that. I would not be willing to take the mortgage over subject to the underlying, or take deed to the property subject to the underlying mortgage. I think the only thing I would be willing to do in this case or in this hypothetical situation would be to do a link option and allow the owner, and explain to the owner our service, our process is such that it gives you time to pay the mortgage down, and that way you don't have to come to the closing table with money. Now, if they're in that situation, again, no money down, and that's not going to be an issue. Clearing a short-term balloon payment, if they bought it on land contract, and I'm assuming that's what we're talking about here, really depends on how much it is, and if you can give up any of that when it comes to getting money from your tenant buyer. So hopefully that makes sense. Next question: do you put sandwich lease option deals in a flip entity? Short-term capital gains in a flip entity? No. I don't think it's necessary, and I'll tell you why. Because there are no short-term capital gains. In a sandwich lease option, you don't take title to the property anyway. So there's no capital gains that is tied to the property when it's sold necessarily. I know this gets into, well, what if you do a simultaneous close? But again, there's ways around that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Do you put sandwich lease option deals in a flip entity? I put them in my LLC. Early on when I was doing deals, I didn't have an LLC for like 2 or 3 years, I think. And so I was putting them in my name. And we made a lot of mistakes. We used the wrong contracts at times. I didn't know what I was doing. I just kind of made a little bit of a mess. But they all worked out. I didn't have any issues. Not saying that you would have any issues or wouldn't have any issues, but really, I just put them in my LLC. And because I'm not taking ownership or title to the property, I have to pay. You have to pay income tax on that. You've got to pay, you know, income tax on them funds coming in. There is a caveat here that I need to say, and you need to talk to your CPA about this. If I'm in a sandwich lease option, I do not have to pay income tax of any kind on any of the option fee money. In other words, if I get $5,000 or $10,000 down, that money is not taxable until one of two things happens. The money is taxed when either A, the tenant buyer cashes out. That's when there is tax on that funds. And if you want to look at it from the standpoint of just being an owner, and you do that with a renter, there is no taxable event that takes place when you get a deposit. So if you're a landlord or you have a rental property, your security deposits are not taxable. Same thing with a lease option and a sandwich lease option. Your option fee is not taxable. So guess what? That money is simply just not reported. It's just not taxable. You either do one of two things with option fees. You either A, not tax any of the option fees in your business until the tenant buyer moves out or they cash out, and you then declare that as income, or B, pay income tax on all of them as you receive them, and you don't have to worry about declaring that when the property sells or the tenant buyer moves out. Whichever one you decide to use, you have to pretty much stay with that tax avenue. So talk to your CPA, and I think that would be that could be made more clear. To take this over, subject to how much equity do you need to have in the deal? Okay, ARV is 150, good condition. Market rent is $1,400 a month. Mortgage payment is $1,400 a month. Okay, to take this over, subject to how much equity do you need to have in the deal? Okay, here's my philosophy on a subject to deal. If there's a minimum of 15% or 20 grand in equity, just like a sandwich lease option, I would certainly do a subject to deal. Now, I don't know what they owe on this house, but let's say they owe $125,000 and the house is worth $150,000, and market rent's $14,000, mortgage payment's $14,000. Are you willing to get a $5,000 or $10,000 option fee down? Maybe market rent might be $1,400, but guess what? Who's to say you can't get $1,495 for that property? Just because market rent says that, because you're offering a service to people who want to own but can't get financed today, go ahead and make it $1,500 or $1,550 or whatever the market will bear. And here's how I do that. I may bump my monthly rent, but I will adjust it down if I get a tenant buyer that has a decent down payment, more than what I'm asking. So I'm more than willing to drop the market rent or my lease payment necessary if they have more than 5% down. That's what I do. So if the house has an ARV of 150 in good condition, and I'm assuming what that means is no repairs, then you're probably, if there's $20,000, $25,000 in equity, I would take it over subject to. If there's repairs, you've got to factor in repairs. So you've got to subtract that out, just like the formula I gave you earlier. So that's how I would do that. Please explain mortgage buy down. Mortgage buy down is simply when you have an owner who is willing to give you rent credits. In other words, let's go back to this scenario here. Let's say you put the house under contract and you're making a $1,400 a month payment to the seller. Mortgage buy down is twofold. Number one is when they're making their mortgage payment, their principal is dropping, Yet at the same time, if you are getting rent credits from the seller, so for every payment you make on time to the seller, let's say you're $1,400, let's say you get a $200 a month rent credit. So for every month you pay the seller, you owe them $200 less in principal for every month that goes by. In the course of, for example, 12 months, at a $200 a month rent credit, you would knock off $2,400 off the price that you would have to cash the owner out if you exercised your option. And so that's taking place by rent credits, and the amount of principal is coming down. At the same time, when they're making their mortgage payment, that principal is dropping as well. So depending on how much principal they're getting versus rent credits, the principal is dropping on their bank side too. So that's what's meant by a mortgage buy-down. When you suggest $0 on option credits, do you mean rent credits? A lot of tenant buyers want rent credits. What is there to offer instead? Okay. I basically do not allow rent credits on sandwich leases anymore because I don't want to be subject to any Dodd-Frank issues. Rent credits can be, not that they are, but potentially could be misconstrued as some type of owner financing. And when it falls into owner financing, what happens is that it could subject you to the SAFE Act. And I just don't offer them. So what is there to offer instead? Nothing. If the tenant buyer wants the house and likes the house, here's the rent. This is the rent. And until you get cash, here's your down payment or your option consideration fee. You put $5,000 down. That takes the price of the home down $5,000. And you could potentially give them a side kind of bonus by saying, hey, you get cashed out within X number of months, the principal will be this amount. If it's a little bit longer, it's this amount. We did a deal where we actually put a tenant buyer in a property. They were eager to get cashed out, and they wanted to negotiate on the piece, on the principal, on the price. So what we did was we said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, if you cash out in 6 months or less, the price of the home will be, and I'm just going to throw these numbers out, $115,000. That'll be the balance. If you cash this out in 6 months or less. If you cash this out between 6 months and a year, the price of the home is $117,000. If it's after 12 months, it's $119,900. So you could write that in the purchase and sale agreement. You could write that right in there. There's always ways to work around rent credits. So everything's negotiable. What percentage of equity do you like to see when looking at a deal? I like personally a minimum of 15% or 20 grand, whichever is greater. Wendy likes on sandwich lease deals a minimum of 40 grand, regardless of the numbers, a minimum of 40 grand. And it's really up to you. It really depends on what you want. Okay, is transactional funding needed for sandwich lease options? No, they're not. How does title transfer work? Is there a double close? No, not necessarily. You can structure it to where you have the seller directly close with the tenant buyer by writing a new purchase and sale agreement so that everybody's on board. And when you work with your title company to get the deal closed, or your title attorney, your real estate attorney, on the HUD-1, what you want to do is you want to take the difference between your back-end spread between the sales price and what you owe the seller, and you want to put that as not a commission. You don't say commission. You would say a consulting fee on the seller's side of the HUD-1. That way, a check is cut to you at one closing, and that works very, very well. So hopefully that makes sense. When do you use a sandwich lease option? When do you use a cooperative lease option? Okay. If there's no equity or very little equity, I do a co-op or link option. and if there is that minimum amount of equity we talked about, 15% or 20 grand, whichever is greater, or in Wendy's case, 40,000, a sandwich lease option is certainly a viable thing, and I push for a sandwich lease if I can first, if there's equity. That's the spread that I want. How can you do a sandwich lease option in your self-directed IRA? If I only use $100 of my IRA, how much could I get back into my IRA from that $100? Okay, well, it depends on the deal, but when I do a sandwich lease option in my IRA, what I do is let's say I use a $100 option fee, and that option fee then goes to the seller, but when I sign the documentation, the property is not in my name or my LLC's name. It has to immediately be signed and placed into my IRA entity. So in this case, if it's, for example, equity trust, my lease and my option agreement is going to be in my purchase and sale agreement. Those are all going to be in my IRA. And my IRA will cut the check for the $100. I don't. And then any proceeds that come in from my tenant buyer, they have to pay my IRA through a coupon system, or they pay me, and not pay me directly, but write the check to my IRA, and I'll mail it into my IRA. And then I have my IRA make the mortgage payment directly every month automatically. I don't have to have them write the check every month on my command, or pay the owner directly, and that gets cut the same day every month and mailed automatically either to the mortgage company or to the owner. So if I put a $100 option fee down, and let's just put a scenario together, how much will I get back in my IRA for $100? Well, let's say I put $100 down. I take control of a property. Let's say it's worth 150 grand. Let's say my mortgage payment is $1,400. So the mortgage payment is $1,400. Well, I find a tenant buyer, and I get $10,000 down, and I get $1,500 a month. Here's how that works. Tenant buyer puts the $1,500 every month into my IRA. The 10 grand goes into my IRA. I don't touch that money. It has to go into my IRA by law, by the tax law. Every month, $1,400 is cut, and a check is mailed to the owner. And a $100 monthly spread stays in my IRA. So for the difference between $1,500 and $1,400, that goes right back into my IRA. That stays in my IRA. So I'm at $10,000 up front. I get a $100 monthly spread. Let's say in 12 months the tenant buyer gets financed. I have $1,200 of monthly spread plus 10 grand. Let's say I got a $20,000 back-end spread between what the tenant buyer is going to pay me for the house and what I paid the owner for the house. That 20 grand goes right back into my IRA. So now I've got a profit of 20 plus 10 plus $1,200. You're looking at about a $31,000, give or take, $31,000, or say $30,000 because you have closing fees, $30,000 for a $100 investment back into your IRA. And if it's a Roth IRA, there's no income tax, there's no sales, there's no capital gains tax, and no income tax even when you take it out. So that's the beauty, and that's the power behind using an IRA. So potentially the return is exceptional. Cover any implications of Dodd-Frank on investing with lease option subject twos. Okay, there is none. There are none because lease options don't fall under the Dodd-Frank bill, and you want to avoid being subjected to that by not advertising for a down payment. So you don't want to advertise a down payment. I never say $5,000 down, X amount per month, based on X amount of interest. That's not in our contracts. We don't put any of that in our advertising. You technically cannot advertise as owner financing, although I'm not too worried about any bandit signs on the front of a house that say owner financing. That's not an issue for me. So these really do not fall into the Dodd-Frank bill as long as you keep a few of those things in mind. So hopefully that helps. Is there any shortfall of the mortgage payment negotiated? Who pays it and when? Okay, if there's any shortfall in the mortgage payment, let's say we're back to our $150,000 property, they owe $1,400 a month, and I've actually told people, owners in the past, hey, I can only give you $1,300. Well, our payment's really $1,400. I understand that, but this is the best I can do, and they accept that. If and when they accept that, guess what happens? They pay the extra $100 to the mortgage company every month. So if I'm paying them, for example, and I give them $1,300, they've got to mail $1,400 into the mortgage company. So that's who pays that, and that's how that's taken care of. On yellow letters, do I need to disclose that I'm a realtor? Yes, you do. Or can I tell them on the phone? Yes, you do. And how would you tell them? Very simply this, I'm not a realtor. Now, Wendy is, and some of you are realtors. So when using yellow letters, you can say something very simply like this. Hi, my name is Jim. I am a realtor. I'm a licensed realtor. However, I'm not contacting you to list your house. I'm contacting you to buy your house. I'm interested in purchasing your property, and then you leave it at that and move on. So you discuss it from the fact that you want to buy the property, and that's as simple as it gets. Okay, but you do have to disclose it. Do you have a problem doing subject to deals as a realtor in Michigan? Okay, this may have been directed to Wendy. I'm not a realtor, but no, I do not believe there's any problems doing any subject to deals as a realtor in Michigan, because once it's disclosed up front, if you're buying it yourself and you're doing it as a subject to, I don't see any problems at all. Certainly you'd want to contact your real estate attorney, but again, not if you are acting as the buyer. So there should be no problem with it when that. When it's not a deal, when you first talk to them, what do you say? Okay, when it's not a deal, when you first talk to them, I'm assuming the owner, what do you say? Well, I typically say something very simply as, you know, based on what we're talking about, looking at the numbers here, I just don't think that there's anything I can do for you at this time. I can't pay what you're asking, or I can't, you know, I'm not able to give you what you're looking at a month, or whatever the case may be, or, you know, you're insisting on $10,000 down, and I just can't do that. Do you mind if I follow up with you in 30 or 45 days just to get an idea if anything changes on your end? And most of the time, that's how I leave it. So, not an, you know, and I'll even say if something changes for you, please give me a call. Here's my number. We've had that happen. At the end of the lease option term, how will the seller get financing when most financial institutions will require 20% down? How will the seller get financing? I've got a feeling that should say, how will the tenant buyer get financing? How will the tenant buyer get financing when most financial institutions require 20% down? Well, financial institutions require 20% down for conventional mortgages. If you're operating within the FHA guidelines of where you live for properties, I can tell you all of the homes that we are doing on options, when the tenant buyer puts a 3.5% or $5,000 quote unquote down payment or option consideration fee down, we're getting them FHA financing. So when they get an FHA financing, they need a minimum of 3%, for example, down. Well, we show that they've already put that down, and that qualifies for FHA financing. So what happens is that they typically do not have to come up with any more down, and our financial institutions, our mortgage brokers are happy to take care of that in that regard. So when it comes to that, that's not an issue. If they are seeking conventional financing, they will have to have 20% down. But again, the people that we're working with, these people don't have 20% down. So they're all typically FHA financing with the exception of a few. And when I say the exception is some of these people are qualified because they're military. They get a VA loan, and that's a much lower down than an FHA. So we do have some people getting VA loans. Why would a seller lease option in a seller's market area when it seems that a seller would want their money now? Well, that's a great question. Maybe they wouldn't want to do a lease option in a seller's market. That doesn't mean somebody won't do a lease option. What if you explain to them, for example, hey, in our area, we have double-digit increase in median sales price. Our home values are going up by 10% a year. Right now, if you were to sell your property, you would make only this amount. But if you can wait for your equity in 1 to 2 years, here's how much you could potentially make with the increase in the market value, not counting the amount of cash flow per month that would be coming in as option fee. So, and then not having to pay a realtor, 6 or 7% or whatever it might be for the broker. So there are many advantages to a seller not putting it on the market, even in a decent market, in a good market. So that's easily shown. And you know what I like? I like Keith and Shannon's. I don't know if some of you have it, but Keith and Shannon French have that Excel spreadsheet that shows if you sell it on the market, here's how much you would make today versus here's how much you could make if you lease option it. That's a great tool. Are realtors, I'm going to pass that one up. Are there usury laws in Michigan? Yes, every state has usury laws. Just look them up. Just Google usury laws for whatever state you live in, and you'll get a ton of information. How do they affect lease option deals? Well, they don't, because we're not selling, we're not moving properties on lease option based on a percentage. In other words, on a 8% mortgage rate or financing rate for this property. So I don't think there's any type of usury law at all that affects lease option deals in our state or any other state for that matter. Where does 15% come from when considering a deal? Does the 15% come from the equity of a home? So the 15%, in other words, yes, if I need to have a minimum of 15% or 20 grand, whichever is greater, let's look at a scenario or two. What if I get a $100,000 home for 85 grand? That's 15%. I buy it for 85 on contract, but I turn around and flip it for 100. That's the equity that I'm creating my income from right there. So I get a 15% equity spread immediately. So that's where it comes from. If it's a $200,000 home, 15% is not going to be 15 grand, it's going to be 30 grand. So if I can pick up a property for 170 grand on contract when the home is worth 200, there's 30,000 in equity spread. So that's where that comes from. Okay. If you offer 150, why would a seller agree to receive only 50 less closing costs and fees? How would that work? If you offer 150, why would a seller agree to receive only 50,000 less closing costs and fees? How would that work? Okay, maybe the question, if I understand it right, is what the seller wants out of the property regardless of when it closes. So if you offer 150 and they owe 100, and let's say that gives them 50 grand less closing costs and fees, that's one way that could work. Another way that could work is, let's say you make them an offer where you say, look, I'll go ahead and I'll put your property under contract for 5 years. I'll make the payments, guarantee the payments and the maintenance until I cash you out. And I'm going to give you $50,000 at closing whenever we close. I have a deal like that right now, similar situation. So in other words, regardless of if I close month number 1 or month number 48 down the road or month number 60, the seller is going to get $50,000 cash at closing. So how does that work? Well, instead of writing a price for the house in the contract, you write down what the seller is going to get at closing, less customary costs and fees. So is it beneficial for me to close month number 1 or month number 60 or further out? Well, in this case, it's better the longer I wait to get financed or get a tenant buyer finance, because their principal, their mortgage principal, is being paid down every month. So as that 100, let's say they owe 100 grand or 125 grand. At the end of 5 years, that 125 grand may be $100,000. So they're still only getting 50 grand at closing. If the house is worth 200,000 bucks, that's a pretty good deal because you're increasing your equity spread another $25,000. I'm not sure if that makes sense, so let me say it a different way. The ARV, let's say in this example, is worth 200 grand. The seller is willing to take 150 or 50,000 at closing, less closing costs and fees. So regardless of when I exercise my option, the owner is going to get 50,000 bucks at closing. Is it smart for me to try to delay or push the closing out further? Yes, because the principal balance will be paid down, and that way I actually owe less the longer the deal goes. So that's how that would work. So I have sellers that definitely do that. They definitely want to do that, and we do make those offers. Do you attend the closing between the seller and the tenant buyer? Yes. When the paperwork has to be changed to 1 closing versus 2. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to make sure everything goes well, the title company understands what we're doing and all those things. And so I'm happy to sit down with the tenant buyer before the seller comes in and sit there also when the seller comes in. Usually they're at a different time. They don't have to be. But again, if we're changing a sandwich lease deal from transactional funding and 2 closings to 1 closing, and I'm getting a consultation fee, the seller and the buyer both know what that fee is going to be. Why? Because it's on the HUD-1. And I've never had a seller argue about how much I'm getting based on a HUD statement and what my consulting fee is. By the way, if you were in our boot camp, you heard this, and maybe I need to clarify this a little bit. I'm willing to pay the owner a little bit more on contract in order to do 1 closing and not have to use transactional funding, because what happens is if I have to get transactional funding and I have multiple closings, 2 closings, and I have twice the closing costs, I'll give the owner an incentive to allow us to do 1 closing, change the paperwork by adding a 2 or 2.5% more to what they were going to get than if we didn't do it that way. And I've never had an issue, and it works perfectly fine. So the seller is more than happy because, well, sure, yeah, we'll change the paperwork. Tell me what you need me to sign. And I'm doing one right now that exact same way, so it works real well. That one's a little long. So I think our time is up. And Wendy thanks you. I thank you. I hope that this was beneficial for you. And we normally go till 6 o'clock. We went a little bit after, but we tried to get as many of these questions in as possible. So I really appreciate you all being on the call, and look forward to talking to you soon. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks so much.